Good morning. Welcome back to Streaming Media Connect 2024, our final day. Now kicking off with our research keynote on live streaming technology trends. I'm Steve Nathans-Kelly, Editor-in-Chief of Streaming Media and chair of this conference. And welcome to this last session, sponsored by Softvelum, best known, of course, the nimble streamer software media streaming server and Lyrics broadcaster app. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping notes. We will be giving away a $50 gift card from Amazon at the end of this session to the Name That Tune winner for the track you just heard, and we'll be announcing that at the end. You must be present to win. Chat in the chat, ask your questions in the Q&A. We're going to go through a lot of data here, but we will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end. And sessions from all 3 days of Streaming Media Connect are already appearing on the Streaming Media YouTube channel. Our associate editor, Tyler Nessler, will be putting that and other links in the chat. And I'd like to welcome to the stage Tim Siglin, Stream Media contributing editor and founder of the Help Me Stream Research Foundation, and Yury Udovichenko, co-founder of Softvelum. Welcome. There you are.
Hi.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here so we can get started. So this is the second year we've done this survey, right? We should also have a link in the chat to the 2023 survey. You can see that, and then the survey that we just finished, that you're going to see a result. You're going to see data from here. That's our brief for that is going to come out sometime in the next couple of weeks, and everyone who has registered for this session will automatically get a copy of that. So just watch for that in your email. So let me bring up my screen here. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes, I can see it, Steve.
Great.
Okay, so as Steve mentioned, my name's Tim Siglin. Actually, my last name's changed. It's Timothy Siglin now, due to the adoption of my daughters. I actually am with Help Me Stream Research Foundation. We do a number of research reports in the industry with streamingmedia.com, as well as taking first world technology junk and repackaging it into streaming solutions for the 1.5 billion people who don't have internet connectivity. But you don't really want to hear about that. You want to hear about live streaming technology trends. So I'm going to also introduce Yury. And Yury, tell the audience just a little bit about Softvelum before we get into the data.
Thanks, Tim. Softvelum creates software solutions for streaming media industry. The flagship product is Nimble Streamer, which is a software media server, and our numerous customers use Nimble Streamer to build streaming infrastructures such as live delivery networks with monetization, content transformation, and protection. We also have mobile contribution tools such as Lyrics broadcaster app, and we've recently released our new product called Lyrics Tuner, which simplifies the remote production workflow for the remote production teams. So as a live streaming solutions vendor, we're glad to sponsor this particular survey for another year, and I'm excited to see what we've got this time.
Thank you, Yury. And we're excited that you sponsored this one as well, because it's nice to see continuity across multiple years. So Steve, with that, let's jump forward past our names and titles and go right to the first slide. So when we look at these surveys, whether it's state of streaming, live streaming technology trends, or other ones that we've done, we want to get a sense of where people are who take the survey. And for the second year in a row, we've got coverage from every part of the world. I think the main difference between last year and this year is Europe was a little higher. I believe Europe was 16 or 17%. Europe dropped off slightly. North America rose slightly. So some of the results you see may vary just a bit from last year for the fact that it's a more North American audience. Let's go on to the next slide, Steve, there. And in this one, Yury, I'm going to let you talk to it, but essentially this is the breakdown of the market verticals of people's business, not what they considered their primary, but across the board, what market verticals did they serve?
Yeah, I mean, as the last year, we see people from all verticals, and this correlates with our own customer base. And I can see that the last year, this was almost the same in terms of exact percentage, except there are more people from live linear and education, as far as I can tell. Is that right?
That is, and in fact, live linear jumped a bit. And one of our takeaways as we're doing the initial analysis is a lot of this may be due to the fact that fast has become more popular in the last year. So while we would traditionally think of live linear broadcast as just a rebroadcast of a live television station or live channel, in reality, there's a lot of fast that's playlist based, where they'll put a playlist up just to have it go through and play these things out in a live linear format. And Yury, I guess from your standpoint, is live linear rising, or do you get the sense that more live, truly live, is actually on the rise?
Well, you're right. We have a play out feature set on Nimble Streamer, and we see it becomes more and more popular over the years. And so you're right. This pretty much correlates with our data as well.
Okay, good. And then on to the next slide, if we break it down into the industries, and I apologize for this, it's sort of an eye chart, but I'll just hit the highlights on it. If you notice, down in the bottom left corner, we've got roughly 6.5% that are OTT operators, whether they're pure play or IPTV. And then up in the top right corner, we have channels, which would be traditional channels, education, entertainment, sports, premium. That accounts for about 15% of the industries that people self-identified as coming from. Consulting companies actually has risen on this survey, and it may skew a bit of the data. We'll talk a little bit to that. And then, of course, production companies. And I think production companies, while that's remained constant over the last 3 years of surveys, that's grown in our survey responses. And those are people who may just be only creating content, but as we'll see in a second on the next slide, we're sort of in this world where people both create and distribute content. And then finally, as Yury mentioned, the education side of the house, that's up to 14.2%. That's primarily secondary, college, and university. So responses from that part of that industry have actually risen as well. Steve, you can go on to the next slide. On this one, and I'll just briefly touch on this, what we've seen over the last few years is a marked shift from those who either only distributed media or only created media to well over half, and now it's 2/3, who are saying that they both create and distribute media. And what this tells me is the industry, has shifted to a point where it's not just enough to say I create content. That 13% who only create media may be the 15% from the prior slide from the production standpoint. But in reality, most people have to think now not just about do I create content, but also how do I distribute it? And that's especially true in the live space, because you are both creating and distributing at the same time. And so it becomes a critical conversation around not just what am I going to produce, but how am I going to make sure that gets out there?
Right.
And Steve, you can go. Yeah, there you go. Yury, you're going to pick up on this one.
Yeah. So besides the fact that you need to live stream your content, but there are a lot of people, a lot of your viewers that want to see it afterwards, and this correlates with that a lot, especially with the sports content. You want to see it real time, live, but there are lots of people that want to watch it later on. So it's not surprising to me, at least.
This was a question that this was the first time we asked. We've always asked before, sort of tell us the mix of your live versus on demand. And this is the first time we've asked this question at the bottom. Tell us, for your sports content, how much of it's delivered live versus on demand. You can see it correlates to sort of the overall mix of live versus on demand, but it was a bit surprising to me that I always sort of see sports as a live thing. I guess I don't think about the fact of going back to watch a game or an event after the fact, but the Olympics probably is a good example of that. That was in, European time zone, and many people, at least in the US, weren't going to be watching it live because it was during the middle of their workday. They were watching it later in the day as a piece of on-demand content.
Well, I think
I mean, you can
probably
tell
factor in there too, sports highlights, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Factors into that.
That's a good point, Steve. Yeah, because clips are something that are shared, especially with social media. Clips of really good goals or points scored tend to be shared. So this was a good survey question for us because it helped me reset sort of my mindset around sports is always live as opposed to sports has this large on-demand component.
Yeah, and let's not forget about the different time zones and different parts of the world, because if you, like, for instance, if we watch the American football, it's the primary audience is in the United States and they all watch live mostly. But if you take rugby, for example, and they play somewhere in Australia, in New Zealand, and someone wants to watch that in England, you see the time difference is like half of the globe. And so you need to watch it on demand primarily.
Right,
And
very good point. All right, the next slide, we talk about CDN strategies. And this has shifted a bit from last year's survey. Last year, multi-CDN was dominant. This year, it sort of matches at about the same point as single CDNs. And internal CDNs also shrunk. And Yury, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about those models on the next slide, but what are your thoughts on this right here in terms of single CDN versus multi-CDN?
Well, I assume later if we look at the later slides about like the sizes of the audience, I believe this is related to the cost reduction, because there are customers who are just serving small crowds of viewers, so why would they bother about multiple CDNs? So, but still, the usage of CDNs is huge because I believe it's due to the fact that they want to concentrate on content itself and user experience rather than like delivery side. They care more about acquisition and processing. So makes sense.
And that's actually a great segue into the content processing workflow slide, which is the next one. And I'll let you, Yury, speak to this one.
Yeah, as I said, people want to concentrate on the processing side, and so AWS it's not a de facto standard, but close to that, and we can see it was lower last year as far as I remember, but it gains more and more ground, and so hybrid on-premise and cloud, and on-premise as well. Tells us that people care more about how they spend their money, and so they prefer using something that they own, something that they control in their hands, and save some money as well. So makes sense to me as well.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, to the shift, last year on-premise was 27%. You can see it's dropped down to roughly 18% now. AWS was at 18% and it rose to 24%. So what's interesting to me on this, and a hybrid grew slightly too, from 17% to 20%. What's interesting to me is that say 2 years prior to this, there was a huge conversation around OpEx cost in the cloud. And of course you have Azure and Google Cloud and other third-party clouds. We've got a few of those listed at the bottom here. There was this sort of sticker shock about 2 years ago with cloud-based services getting the bill for that kind of thing. And so I think last year was somewhat a reaction against that, where people started to say, let's bring it on-prem and do our content processing workflow there. This year, what we see is, because hybrid grew and AWS grew, the likelihood is there were conversations with the accounting department around, we're not going to spend that much money on the CapEx side, figure out a way to sort of balance between doing certain things in the cloud and doing certain things on premise. One piece that came up loud and clear in comments was, people said, use the cloud for transcoding or transrating or transmuxing, because that's where you're going to have a constant heavy lift of having to convert from one codec to another codec, or one format to another. I know obviously your focus is live with the products you all have, Yury. Is transmuxing and transcoding a pretty big deal in the live space as it is in the on-demand space?
Well, transmuxing is not a big deal because it's a relatively cheap operation, at least in our products, in terms of resources. But transcoding is still a thing, and you want to take as much hardware as you can in case of various. If you own, not own, but if you have the right for processing multiple live channels, for example, and those channels goes 4K, go downstream as 4K. That's going to be a challenge for you. If you just process just one stream, like one channel or a couple of channels, not a big deal. But still, you want to take care of your hardware baseline where you transcode that. And so we see a lot of our customers use on-premise transcoding, using those transcoders as an input for Nimble Streamer, which then takes care of like content protection and delivery and all sorts of things like monetization. But yeah, that's a heavy lifting part, which needs to be taken care of like with a good care. And then it goes to those CDNs that we talked previously. And AWS can be a thing as well, because we see a lot of people use like NVIDIA in the cloud, for example. We see we see more demand on that, not demand, but more customers mashing that. And so AWS takes a lot of pieces from that pie.
That's a really good point. And I'll also mention here too, we're not going to necessarily show the slides around video codecs and audio codecs, but this year, H.265 HEVC rose significantly compared to last year. So again, that becomes a question of transcoding. If you're acquiring in 265, but the majority of your viewers are 264, you have to have that as part of your content workflow. Otherwise, you're only hitting those with the most recent phones or portable devices, versus the vast majority who still have H.264 as the primary. Right.
And if your end user devices are capable of like using HEVC as an input, you will obviously take that as advantage and will encode into H.265 to like lower your bandwidth, which is like critical in terms of when you stream to a lot of people at the same time. So transcoding resource consumption is a key here.
Okay, good. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So this slide, we essentially asked the same question earlier, but we're asking this in a slightly different way. When we say to people, tell us your mix of on-demand versus live, and we ask the question about your sports content being live versus on-demand, this one says, okay, if you have streaming only content, what percentage of your content is delivered live? And what we see here is the 0 to 25 mark takes up almost half of this, and the 26 to 50% mark takes up 13%. So all told, we're essentially looking at 57% of the content that's streaming only content is delivered as on demand versus is delivered as live versus on demand. On the flip side, the 31% for the 76 to 100, that grew significantly in this survey. And I put that down to the fact that we had a lot more traditional broadcasters. And as we'll see in some of the subsequent slides here, they're using technologies that a lot of us would consider outdated, but it's still really good for doing live delivery. And before we go on to the next slide, do you have any other thoughts on that particular one?
I mean, yeah, that matches with our customer base, like in part because we have customers who use VOD feature set like all the time. The majority of our customers are concerned with live streaming, but VOD is a huge thing for a lot of customers as well. They use it in parallel with live streams. There are a few customers who use VOD only, and but it's not that huge percentage as we see here. So our experience differs a little bit from the survey.
Okay. And you can go ahead and take the next slide on concurrent viewers, especially since you mentioned that up top.
Yeah, so this correlates with our stats because, besides Nimble Streamer, we have a reporting and control panel that allows people for gathering their stats. And we see combined stats per entire customer base, and we see that like small events, small concurrent viewers is a thing, which was surprising for us first, but not anymore. I correlate that with the fact that people do streaming of a lot of local events, like local sports events, like local churches or funerals or whatever. And so those are this is something that does not expect broad audience. And then, of course, there are majors. There are a lot of, not a lot, but there are customers who would use everything they've got to stream to larger audiences, like news channels, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So not surprised with that. And for those who want to build the streaming infrastructures, they want to think up front about how many people will actually consume their content simultaneously. And because if you want to build an infrastructure for like 50,000 viewers, simultaneous viewers, it's one thing, it's one cost. If you target 10 times less, it's going to be a lot cheaper than that. And so I hope someone will find this useful and will think about that in their own events. Yeah.
Well, and I'm going to add too that the fewer than 500 in the last survey was 45%, so it's grown to 49%. But also the more than 50,000 was 10% before and grew to 11%. So we have that sort of bifurcation, so to speak, in the market where you've got live streamers who are clearly delivering to audiences that are very large. And then you've got this group, as you said, who are doing a much smaller, whether it's niche or whether the audience size is constrained. What was interesting in one of the honorable mentions when we were talking about content processing, several people mentioned YouTube Live. And I know, for instance, in the US, the houses of worship market relies heavily on YouTube Live because the assumption is the people who can't attend the physical service are either going to go to Facebook Live or they're going to go to YouTube to see if they can actually watch the service. In many of those instances, we're talking about an audience of 20 or fewer people who are watching it live. But the reason the houses of worship market likes that is those are also then automatically converted into on-demand content. So if somebody can't be there at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning or 6 p.m. on a Saturday evening, they can come back and catch up on it later. And the workflow happens without them having to really think about that, which I think is especially key in civic organizations where it's a volunteer group of people who live streaming may not be their day job, so to speak.
Yeah, and that reminds me of of our experience with our live streaming apps that we make. We see end users that are streaming from the mobile devices, and we see a lot of cases where they we ask people like where they stream, like what's the destination of those streams. And a lot of people use some like processing with OBS Studio or Vmix, and then it goes live to YouTube or Facebook Live or whatever, because it's the cheapest way to deliver the signal to those who want to see that. Because it's just regular people that want to hang out and see what's going on with what you produce. A lot of contributors, a lot of IRL streamers, they just walk in the street and just stream it live on YouTube.
Mhm.
It's a norm. It's like half of them do that. It's either YouTube or Twitch. There's no need for CDN or whatever, and the audience may vary. It depends on popularity of the IRL streamer, but a lot of them are small. They don't need large crowds, and that's quite interesting. Like the recent example I saw a couple of days ago, a company mentioned us and our product in relation with, they have a bicycle event, a bicycle race, and they endorse their cyclists, like use Lags broadcast, like for example, use Lags broadcaster to stream to our destination, and we're going to process it and put it live on YouTube and any other platforms. And that's it. They concentrate on the production side rather than the delivery side, and YouTube Live would be a great choice for them. But as we see on this slide, it correlates with this slide. The audience is like fewer than 500 people or fewer than 5,000 people, not more, because it's a local event, concentrated and concerned with bicycling, nothing else. Yeah.
That's actually an interesting point where they can essentially use those as camera feeds back to the main processing point. Yeah. I would add, though, for those people who are in this, say, 18% range that are doing 10,000 to 10,000 concurrent viewers and above, make sure you're using a multi-CDN strategy, because first of all, it's going to help you guarantee the delivery, because when you get to audiences of that size, they're probably spread out across different devices and different geographies. And secondly, using a multi-CDN approach as opposed to using a YouTube Live or even a Twitch, your revenue opportunity is significantly higher if you own that delivery workflow than if you're relying on these services who are going to extract a sizable amount of money out of your revenue stream.
Right.
All right, so we can go on to the next slide. So here, talking about devices and talking about being spread out, the primary difference this year from last year is desktops and laptops laptops specifically fell a little further down the chain. Smartphones, it's very clear when people are consuming live content that they need to be able to do that from a smart mobile device. The other thing that's interesting is pay TV set-top boxes sort of rose in the rankings, and my assumption was those were on their way out, but we seem to have quite a few respondents who said their consumers primarily consume the content through a pay TV set-top box versus a smart TV or OTT streaming device. Yury, what are your thoughts on this slide?
From technical, like this is interesting for me from technical perspective, like primarily from the standpoint of bandwidth, resolution, FPS, because like if we see at this chart, the mobile consumption is still about half. Like if we combine smartphone, laptop, and tablet, which we consider as like portable devices, it's still half, and their typical resolution is like 1080p, and they use, especially with the tablet or smartphone, when you're on the go, chances are you're using the mobile network, and your resolution will be lower, and you'll use lower bandwidth as a result of that. So, but still, there's another half which is not concerned with the bandwidth or resolution, and you need to target them as well. You need to think about them still.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no.
I was going to say, as a matter of fact, on our state of streaming surveys, we've begun asking the question in the last 3 surveys, how much of your content's delivered to portable devices or battery powered versus mains powered? And we're finding it is consistently staying right around that half point. So it's not enough to have a strategy just to deliver to mobile devices. You also have to have a strategy to deliver to connected TVs and higher resolution devices as well.
Yeah, one small point I want to add is that our geography of this survey says that like 80+% are either North America or Europe.
Yeah.
But there's a huge growing segment of the rest of the world, especially like Southeast Asia, India, and all those countries where mobile devices are the primarily device for the consumption, especially Indonesia and Malaysia. It's like it's like mobile device only countries. You don't find a fancy smart TV in every home, right?
And that's
So
even
it depends on
true.
the geography.
Yeah, Nigeria and Ghana, where I've worked, that's also
Right,
very
right.
well. So that's a valid point, that the survey results are skewed slightly to sort of the European, North American market. And therefore you've got this ability to sit and have a big smart TV, where if you're in another market, you're going to end up primarily watching the content on your smartphone.
Right.
Let's jump on, and Yury, I think you're going to take the next slide where we talk about the low latency solution. So let's talk to this just a bit.
As far as I remember, last year, WebRTC and NDI were smaller in numbers. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep, they were.
Yeah. So we still see RTMP as like the de facto standard for the contribution side, and later on we have other questions about RTMP as well. And the rise of NDI and WebRTC, I mean, looks pretty good to me, because we see NDI, the demand for NDI streaming in our product, as well as WebRTC, because it becomes more and more accessible. People can stream from browsers. The technology is becoming more and more simple. Like in our case, we added WebRTC Nimble Streamer like a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, and it becomes more and more popular because it's more accessible, because people can stream from browsers which adopted the WebRTC completely, but at this point of time. And so it's natural for a lot of people to use browser like we do now. As for NDI, it also like it correlates with all the companies in our list in our survey that are related to live production of any sort, because NDI is a de facto standard for the video contribution, video processing in those companies. So it would be interesting to see the results of the next year, to see who's going to be the second one. Would it be the NDI or WebRTC? That's quite interesting.
Well, and I'll also point out too that traditional video conferencing fell about 2%. So NDI has obviously taken some of that market share, where you would traditionally think about setting up multi-point video conferencing. You can now do it with NDI across wide area networks as well. RTSP rose slightly as well, which again, we talked about the fact that this survey has a number of sort of traditional broadcasters. And I think, as we'll see in later slides, RTSP is one of those that's sort of a tried and true standard that we don't talk a lot about, but continues to have traction in the market.
And the question was specifically about low latency solutions to acquire. So, like, yeah, not a lot of people consider other technologies as low latency, but whereas in fact they are. Yeah, like for example, we see Zoom as mentioned there. We see UDP as the source because it's like any other protocol. It's close to real time. So it's a matter of terminology. The same applies to video conferencing because most of the modern days video conferencing is based on WebRTC, and so not a lot of people like correlate those two, but still, yeah. So as I said, it will be interesting to see what will be the next year.
And that's a perfect segue into the next slide around latency, which I know you're going to talk a little bit too as well.
Yeah, same as last year. This was quite surprising for me, but not too much, because a lot of people think about ultra low latency as like different things. Like more than 2 seconds, to me, it's not ultra low latency, but a lot of people still think it is, and that's 1/5, like 20%. And so, as far as I remember, we can see the shift in numbers. I think more people consider more than 2 seconds as a lot ultra low latency last year, but still. And so, depending on what you think, what you think, like what you define as ultra low latency, this will define your costs as well, because the lower you go into the latency, the more you need to pay for every hundreds of millisecond you reduce your delivery with. And so people starting to realize that and start to like count their money, start to like think about what technology will be in the baseline of the low latency streaming. So that's quite interesting to see.
And I think to add to your point about the shift from last year, so last year it was almost truly bifurcated. Those who said 2 seconds or higher, and those who said 500 milliseconds and lower. This year, it seems like the education of the market has begun, because our average now is averaging out around 750 milliseconds. While we might not consider that real time or ultra low latency, that's certainly better from the standpoint of, sort of getting closer to real time than it was where we were last year with the 2 second mark. So I think this is the other thing to remember on this too, is, as you mentioned, if you're going to do low latency, you have to pay extra to do low latency. And
exactly.
We're asking people what their expectation is. They may also very easily be saying, I don't want to pay the extra for that. It's good enough to do it at the 2 second mark. And that's the other thing we have to keep in mind here, is from a expectation versus a cost to deliver it this way, there still seems to be a really wide gap in terms of what people are willing to pay for on the 500 millisecond, 250 millisecond or lower space.
Right. And not to mention that not everybody needs like ultra low latency, because for most of the people, like standard 10-second delay of HLS is like more than enough. It's fine.
All right, we're going to click through the next 3 slides fairly quickly, just to, and I'll just emphasize the point here that that Yury and I have both been making. There is a significant market at the low end for those people who are doing, say, 500 subscribers or viewers per month, and there's a growing market at the upper end for those who are doing over 10,000. When the report comes out, if you'll correlate back and forth between this and the concurrent viewers, you'll see that there's a relatively consistent pattern that says when you hit 1,000 or more, you have to start thinking in different directions. When you're below that, and especially if you're below 500 or even 100, you can sort of rely on any technology that's out there, any service that's out there, and move on from that. Now, having said that, let's jump on to the next slide where we talk about the average resolution of content. The other thing we've seen here that's interesting is on the last 2.5 years of surveys, 4K had actually been dropping, and now we're starting to see it rise again, to the point where our sweet spot is actually coming out in the 1080p 60 range, as opposed to before it had come out in the 1080p 24, 25, 30 range. And what that tells me is, along with the jump in HEVC or H.265, we've got an established viewer base that can watch that 4K content. Therefore, the effort being put into doing 1080p 60 or 4K 24, 25, 30 is rising quite a bit. Yury, just quickly, your thoughts on the average resolution?
Yeah, as last year, 1080p dominates. Well, not quite dominates, but yeah, this year it dominates. 720p is still popular among mobile streamers and mobile viewers. But as the bandwidth capabilities of the networks rise, we see that more and more people go to 1080p. So no surprise here.
And it is good to point out that 25% still use 720p, and that's one of the things that I've also consistently seen is that part of the market has retention where I thought it would fall off. It's actually sort of sticking in quite nicely, and that leads into the next slide where we talk about average bit rates, and you'll see that the 1.5 megabit per second takes up over a third. But that if you take our sweet spot in this, we've moved from traditionally saying the sweet spot was 2.5 to 5 megs a second to now seeing more of a shift toward 8 megs a second. Again, this may be because it's a much larger North American, European audience, but
yeah,
frankly, for live content, you're looking for, if you've got the bandwidth to spare, you're looking for the ability to actually put content out at a slightly higher data rate because you need that since you don't have 2-pass VBR and that type of thing in live. Okay, and then let's jump on, and Yury, I'm going to let you touch on both of these next two slides. These are around the security strategies and features.
Yeah, well, all these technologies, just like last year, I would say they're equally important to the people. We see the same thing among our own customer base, where security and content production feature set is like the most popular right after the live streaming itself. So we see all that. We see people applying most of those features at the same time, except maybe for DRM because it needs like more efforts. But other than that, correlates with our data, and we see that it's really important for people to protect their content because they want to monetize that. They want to monetize it, and therefore they need to protect it as much as they can.
Let's see the next slide there. These are DRM and security features.
Yeah, the DRM security features. So we still see like last year, we see low latency secure streaming as the top interest. It's not. This does mean that all the people actually want to they have implemented that, but they are certainly interested in that. From our standpoint, it's like the low latency itself is a expensive thing to do, as we spoke previously about that. So applying security on top of low latency costs even more, especially when it comes to like WebRTC streaming, low latency streaming. You need to like figure out the way to protect your content efficiently and monetize it at the same time. Like we can do that with our feature set, but like it's still something that people need to discover, try, implement, try in action, etc., etc. And so, as for DRM, like half of those responses were about the DRM of any sort. So when people think about like the real protection, and they want to spend some money on that, DRM is the obvious choice because even though you pay something for that, you have like the payback for that payout. So,
and as a matter of fact, there was a really good panel that I led at Stream Media NYC around casual piracy versus professional piracy. And if your content is premium, and you're looking to do low latency, please consider a low latency secure streaming, and at a minimum consider DRM, because it's no longer models of where 50 people are trying to steal your content. It's really organized efforts around high value content that are then being stolen, repackaged, and transmitted out so that the pirates can make money off of your streams as opposed to you making money off your stream.
Yeah.
And okay, and speaking of that, that sort of leads into the next slide, which I'm just going to touch briefly on. CapEx, as I said earlier, about a year and a half ago, the sticker shock of the cloud had led to CapEx being the highest concern. That sort of settled back now, and operational expenses, as well as content costs, which continue to rise both in terms of purchasing rights, but also in terms of going out and creating original content. Those 3+ distribution networks are the top 4 concerns that people have. Now let's shift gears and talk about some of the technologies. And I'll lead off on this next slide here. We asked a set of questions this time, 2 questions that we've not asked before. Last year, we saw RTMP showing that it was used consistently. And so we wanted to know whether that was just sort of a byproduct of a whole bunch of RTMP having been legacy in the past, and would it fall away? So we asked the question this time, both on the acquisition side and the delivery side, what is your RTMP usage? And you'll notice that it's consistent on the holding steady at roughly 54%. And it's fairly consistent on the growing as well. So if we take holding steady and growing, we're essentially at 3/4 of our survey respondents said not only are we going to continue to use RTMP, we're possibly even going to be growing our RTMP usage. Yury, what do you make of this? Because RTMP, you know, if you believe the marketing hype, shouldn't be used because it's so old.
Well, despite despite of its age, it is still popular because it's a legacy protocol that can be used anywhere you want. In addition to that, latest developments, latest initiatives to support, to extend the protocol were pretty successful, because the latest enhanced RTMP spec that was supported by a number of vendors. We jumped in, obviously, as one of the first vendors who supported that, which allowed for transporting HEVC and AV1 via RTMP to where you want. But it's like, okay, we're just software vendors, but we were surprised to see YouTube adopting that same protocol, that same extension, which allowed people to stream HEVC to YouTube via RTMP from the encoders that actually support this extension of RTMP protocol. For instance, I saw a lot of people streaming HEVC from mobile devices to YouTube from Linux Broadcaster, and that they liked it a lot. And so RTMP is still alive. They have I know that the group of people that extended RTMP with video protocols, they want to extend it with audio protocols as well, which means that it's going to be delivering OGG, Vorbis, FLAC, whatever you can think about. And so the RTMP is still here. It's not dying.
So let's actually jump to the next slide and sort of just show how much it's here. If you look at this, and it's interesting that you talk about extending RTMP to deliver newer codecs. If you look at the first and the third, MPEG transport stream is the same way, originally designed to deliver MPEG-2. You know, the ability then to chop those to repackage payloads that were MPEG-4 Part 10 or AVC H.264, essentially tried and true technologies that are being repurposed forward from that standpoint. Having said that, SRT, has risen up the list, continues to rise up the list. I know SRT gets a lot more ink, so to speak, in terms of people talking about SRT. But is it surprising to you that RTMP is on top, or is that sort of just assumptive from your standpoint that RTMP is going to stay around for quite a while?
It will stay around just because the hardware that it's there, it's not going anywhere within the next few years. And so it's a cycle of changing the hardware, cycle of changing all the elements of this delivery chain from RTMP to SRT. And so no wonder that it works like this. And no wonder that SRT is still like the runner-up. It's on the second place still. We see the same thing on mobile devices. We see the stats that our mobile users use RTMP more than SRT. It's like it's not that dramatically. It's not that dramatic difference. It's like 2-1 RTMP to SRT in our case.
Okay.
It's smaller than here, but still. So not surprised.
So just really quickly, that was the slide that said, tell us all the ingest protocols. The next slide is what's your primary one? Again, RTMP. I think MPEG TS is number 2 on this slide because of the traditional broadcasters we have. SRT on the list as well. For sake of time, let's jump then to delivery protocols. And in this one, HLS doesn't surprise me whatsoever. Again, we're asking to tell all the delivery protocols. WebRTC does sort of surprise me, but you're saying that essentially because people are doing things like video conferencing on the web, that live delivery piece is why live bidirectional is why WebRTC has risen in terms of a delivery protocol.
Well, actually, this one is a bit surprising for me because traditionally WebRTC is not something that is considered as a delivery protocol for the masses. But yeah, I mean, it still can be used in this role. Yeah, well, Dash share is more surprising for me. Well, same surprising as WebRTC. But still, it shows the diversity of the survey, of the people who took survey.
And it also shows the point that service providers and software providers need to actually support multiple acquisition and delivery protocols as opposed to just relying on RTMP on the ingest side and HLS on the delivery side.
Yeah.
Okay, so we had, let's see, I believe we have some questions. One person asked, is it common to use DRM for live streaming? And obviously I'm going to hand that question to you, Yury, because you're much more knowledgeable on that than I am.
Oh, yeah. Live streaming DRM protection is the first thing that we implemented in our media server when it came to DRM, because that's what people were asking about primarily. We then added VOD DRM, but still live DRM is the primary thing when it comes to DRM. So it's a big deal there.
And from a DRM standpoint, we had Common Encryption Scheme a number of years ago where it was sort of 5 big DRMs. Has it fallen to 1 or 2 DRMs these days that people use for live streaming versus the 4 or 5 that they use for on demand?
Well, are we talking about vendors of DRM solutions, or are we talking about the encryption protocols, encryption mechanisms?
More the encryption backends.
Yeah, encryption is still those 3. It's Google Widevine, Apple FairPlay, Microsoft PlayReady. But we see less PlayReady as time goes by. Google. Well, lately Google made, not Google, but it became possible to deliver Widevine with HLS, which means that if you want to protect HLS, you don't need to rely on Apple FairPlay for this. We saw some steps in this direction, and we see that Widevine probably will become not the standard, but the preferred solution for those who want to protect their content with DRM. And we see that PlayReady is slightly going away, but that's just our observation.
And speaking of HLS, as you mentioned, in terms of the security side, somebody asked another question that said, doesn't RTMP for delivery still require a special player SDK versus the fact that HLS and Dash work on native players. I know that was true in the past. Is that true now?
Well, in this case, when people say delivery, the responders of our survey, when they said delivery, they basically meant that they deliver the signal out of the production facility somewhere. Especially if we take a look at this multi or single CDN strategy, this means that if you deliver RTMP signal out, people think it's the delivery for them, but it's not the delivery for the end users. Still, there are some set-top boxes that can use RTMP for that. No wonder that it's still in the on the delivery side for both from both the end user devices and from the technology that is used to deliver to the CDN as well.
Okay, that makes sense. And obviously from the standpoint of delivery, what we didn't specify in there is delivery to the CDN or service versus delivery to the end user. From the end user standpoint, that you're absolutely right. There tends to not be a whole lot of RTMP going directly to the user player and like that. All right, Steve, so we are close to the top of the hour, and I know you want to give away a prize. So
Yeah. So thanks, Tim. Thanks, Yury. That was a great discussion, and it's great to see all this data. And just a reminder that because you registered for this session, you should be receiving an email that will tell you how to get the data and how to get the full report on what you saw today. And yeah, so our gift card winner is Janam Shah for correctly identifying the blackbird by Sharon Shannon. Congratulations, Janam. You should be there. You are, and yeah. You'll receive an email letting you know how to claim your prize. So with that, we will. I want to thank Tim Siglin and Yury Udovichenko, and of course thank Softvelum for our sponsor for this session. Thanks everyone for coming, and please join us at 11:30 Eastern time for our great debate on is AI in a bubble or not in a bubble with Evan Shapiro and three more great debaters. And if you join as an audience, you will actually get to decide who wins the debate. So please join us, and hope we see you then. Thanks.
awesome.